Hey you. Yes you. Where are you watching from and what time is it right now? Drop it in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now let's get into tonight's true crime case. So don't forget subscribe this channel and turn on notification. Story 1. I never imagined that a simple business trip to Berlin would change everything I thought I knew about my life, and about a man whose presence in the tech world was as formidable as it was enigmatic. The story I am about to recount is not one of horror or violence, but rather of mystery, silence, and the strange void left behind when a person simply vanishes without explanation. I arrived in Berlin on a cold January morning, the sky a muted gray, as if the city itself was still waking from a long winter sleep. The crisp air carried the scent of distant snow, mingling with the faint aroma of roasted chestnuts from a nearby street vendor. My purpose was straightforward. I was there to meet Klaus Brenner, the CEO of Novistech, a pioneering company in artificial intelligence and advanced robotics. Klaus was a figure I admired from afar, someone whose visionary ideas had reshaped entire industries. His company was headquartered in a modern glass tower overlooking the Spree River, a symbol of Berlin's blend of history and cutting-edge innovation. My role was that of a consultant, helping Novistech navigate the complex ethical landscapes emerging from their recent breakthroughs. Klaus was known not only for his brilliance, but for his insistence on transparency and responsibility in technology. I respected his dedication, and I was eager to meet him in person, to see the man behind the headlines. The first 2 days in Berlin passed in a blur of meetings, presentations, and discussions. Klaus was punctual, calm, and methodical, always focused, yet approachable. He had an aura of quiet confidence that put everyone at ease. We toured the labs, watched prototypes move and adapt, and delved into the future possibilities of artificial intelligence. It was inspiring, exhilarating even, to witness the frontier of human ingenuity. Then, on the third day, everything changed. I arrived at Novistech's office early, as usual, to prepare for the morning briefing. Klaus was expected to lead the session, but he never appeared. Initially, I thought he might be delayed by traffic or an urgent call. Yet, as the minutes ticked by, a subtle unease settled over the team. The receptionist checked in with his assistant. No response. Calls to his personal phone went unanswered. What followed was a slow, methodical search through the office. Klaus's workspace was untouched, his belongings neatly arranged as if he had stepped out for a moment. His laptop was open, files meticulously organized. There was no sign of a struggle, no indication he had left in haste. The news spread quickly. Novistech issued a statement that Klaus Brenner was temporarily unreachable, but assured that all efforts were underway to locate him. The media caught wind of the story, and Berlin's bustling streets whispered with speculation. A tech CEO simply disappearing from one of the most secure offices in the city was unheard of. Days passed. Berlin police began their investigation, canvassing the surrounding areas, checking surveillance cameras, interviewing employees and acquaintances. Yet, there was no trace. No sightings, no messages, no emails. Klaus had simply vanished. I stayed in Berlin longer than planned, partly out of professional obligation, partly driven by a need to understand. I wandered the city's quiet neighborhoods during the cold evenings, retracing his last known steps. The cobblestone streets and historic facades, the glowing windows of cafes, and the muted hum of the city at night all seemed untouched by the mystery that gripped me. There were theories, some rational, some fanciful. Had Klaus staged his disappearance to escape the pressures of his position? Was he kidnapped, or worse? The absence of evidence suggested none of these. Instead, I felt there was something deeper, a subtle shift that eluded comprehension. What struck me most was the impact on those closest to him. His team operated with an eerie calm, driven perhaps by shock or determination to protect his legacy. The city, too, seemed to absorb the mystery, a silent witness to the unknown. One evening, as the sky faded from twilight to deep night, I found myself standing by the Spree River near the company's headquarters. The water mirrored the city lights, shimmering with reflections that danced like fleeting thoughts. In that moment, I understood something essential. Klaus Brenner's disappearance was not a story of loss alone, but a reminder of the fragility of presence, the delicate thread that connects us to the world and to each other. Days turned to weeks, and still Klaus remained missing. The company pushed forward, as technology always does, yet the void he left was palpable. It was as if a lighthouse had gone dark, its beams swallowed by fog. I eventually left Berlin, carrying with me not answers but questions. Questions about identity, about the pace of progress, and about the spaces between moments that define our existence. In the months that followed, I kept track of the developments, hopeful for any news, but prepared to accept the silence. Klaus Brenner became more than a CEO to me. He became a symbol of the unknown, a quiet enigma in the ever-changing landscape of technology and humanity. The city of Berlin, with its resilience and history, absorbed the mystery and moved on, as cities do. But for me, the disappearance of Klaus Brenner remained a haunting reminder that some stories do not end with resolution, but with the lingering presence of questions left unanswered. In the weeks that followed Klaus's disappearance, Berlin seemed to hold its breath, as if the city itself sensed something unseen had shifted beneath its surface. The usual hum of activity, the chatter in cafes, the footsteps on sidewalks, the clatter of trams, continued uninterrupted. Yet, for those who knew Klaus, or who followed the story closely, there was a strange quiet, a shared unspoken tension hanging in the cold winter air. I found myself returning to the Novistech building multiple times, standing across the Spree riverbank watching its illuminated glass facade. The tower was both a monument to human achievement and a stark reminder of the fragility of control. Inside that gleaming structure, a man who had shaped so much had simply ceased to be seen. People speculated endlessly. Was Klaus overwhelmed by the immense pressure of leading a company at the forefront of artificial intelligence? Had he chosen to disappear to reclaim a life lost amid algorithms and board meetings? None of these theories felt satisfying to me. Something about Klaus was different. There was no trace of despair or escapism in the way he conducted himself. His passion was genuine, his commitment unshakable. Instead, I began to focus on the spaces he left behind, the absence of his presence in places where it once had been. In his office, a small shelf of books remained neatly arranged. Titles on philosophy, science, and history. A framed photograph of the Berlin skyline at dusk stood on his desk, capturing the city's fading light. These remnants were like whispers of a man who lived both in the world of ideas and in the tangible reality around him. One day, while sorting through notes I had taken during meetings, I noticed an odd detail. Klaus had spoken often about the edge, the threshold between human consciousness and machine intelligence, a frontier Novistech was trying to explore carefully. He believed that technology should extend humanity, not replace it. But what if, I wondered, he had himself stepped beyond that edge? The thought felt unsettling, yet oddly fitting. In his pursuit of innovation, could Klaus have found a path that no one else had dared to follow? It was not science fiction or fantasy. It was a question about identity and presence, about what it means to exist in a world where technology blurs the lines between the physical and the digital. Berlin's winter deepened. Snow dusted the rooftops and blanketed the quiet parks. I took long walks through the Tiergarten, seeking clarity amid nature's stillness. The cold air sharpened my senses, and I found solace in the small details. The way breath hung visibly in the air, the soft crunch of footsteps on frozen ground, the gentle sway of bare branches silhouetted against the pale sky. At times, I would pause at the memorial plaques scattered throughout the city, honoring those lost in times past. Their names etched in stone seemed like a solemn acknowledgement of life's impermanence. Klaus's disappearance felt different. There was no body, no closure, only a void where a life had once been vibrant and full. Despite the growing mystery, life at Novistech pressed on. The company's projects advanced with relentless energy, driven by Klaus's team of dedicated scientists and engineers. They seemed determined to honor his vision by pushing forward, as if to defy the silence left behind. Yet, even as they built the future, the question lingered. Was Klaus still out there somewhere, watching from a distance, or had he become part of something entirely new? I met with colleagues and friends who had worked closely with Klaus. Without words, their expressions told stories of disbelief and hope mingled with grief. They described his brilliance, his kindness, his unyielding curiosity. For them, his disappearance was a wound in the fabric of their daily lives. One evening, as I sat by the window of my rented apartment, the city lights shimmering like distant stars, I reflected on how technology and humanity coexist in this modern age. Klaus Brenner was a man who stood at the crossroads of these worlds. His absence was a reminder that no matter how advanced we become, some mysteries resist explanation. Berlin, with its layered history, from the echoes of the Cold War to the vibrant present, felt like a fitting stage for this unresolved story. The city had known division and reunification, loss and renewal. Klaus's disappearance added a new chapter, one written in silence and shadows. Months later, a faint rumor emerged. A fleeting glimpse of Klaus in a remote cafe far outside Berlin, a place where no one would expect a tech CEO to be. The report was unconfirmed, and no evidence followed. It was as if the city itself refused to let go of the possibility that Klaus might return, that the story was not yet over. In the end, I left Berlin with a profound sense of humility. The disappearance of Klaus Brenner was not a puzzle to be solved, but a meditation on absence and presence, on the limits of our understanding. It was a story about the space between knowing and not knowing, about how some lives leave an imprint not through their physical presence, but through the questions they inspire. I keep a photograph of the Berlin skyline on my desk now, the same image from Klaus's office, a reminder of that cold January and the man who vanished like a shadow into the city's depths. And every so often, I wonder what it means to truly disappear, and if, somewhere beyond the edge, Klaus Brenner has found a new way to exist. Story 2. The sun had barely risen over the horizon when I first stepped onto the gleaming white dome of the Louvre Abu Dhabi. The morning light filtered through the intricate latticework of the museum's iconic roof, casting a delicate pattern of shadows on the polished floors below. It was the kind of light that made the entire structure feel almost sacred, a place suspended between time and space, where art and history converged in breathtaking harmony. I was not here as a visitor seeking inspiration, nor as a casual admirer of masterpieces. My purpose was far more urgent and unsettling. I had been called in as a consultant for the museum's security team after a suspicious series of alerts in the previous weeks. Something was amiss, though no one had yet dared to say it aloud. The whispers of a possible heist lingered beneath the calm surface of this cultural sanctuary. The Louvre Abu Dhabi is more than just a museum. It is a symbol of collaboration and cultural exchange, a bridge between East and West, past and present. Its vast galleries house treasures that span centuries. Paintings, sculptures, artifacts carefully preserved and displayed with meticulous attention. Walking through these halls, one feels the weight of history but also the fragile beauty of creation. As I moved through the spacious corridors, I observed the silent vigilance of the security personnel. Cameras were everywhere, their lenses unblinking guardians watching over priceless collections. Access points were tightly controlled, and the museum's advanced alarm systems were said to be state-of-the-art. Yet, beneath this fortress of technology, I sensed a subtle vulnerability, a crack in the armor waiting to be explored. Days before my arrival, an early warning had come from one of the electronic sensors near the Impressionist wing. The alert was brief and quickly dismissed as a false positive. But it was the first in a series of anomalies. Unexplained power fluctuations, doors left unlocked for mere moments, security patrols reporting shadows where no one should have been. The museum's director was a calm, reserved figure, deeply committed to the institution's mission. He welcomed me with quiet gratitude, hopeful that my expertise could help uncover what he referred to as an emerging threat. His concern was palpable, though carefully controlled. During my initial assessment, I reviewed security footage, sensor logs, and staff schedules. Nothing overt stood out, yet the pattern of minor irregularities suggested deliberate probing, a reconnaissance by someone with inside knowledge. I began to suspect that this was not the work of an amateur, but a calculated operation, designed to exploit the museum's vast scale and complexity. The Louvre Abu Dhabi's design is both a marvel and a challenge. Its sprawling layout, with interconnected galleries and hidden service corridors, provides numerous pathways for movement, perfect for an intruder who knew the building intimately. I requested full access to the museum's architectural plans and security systems, determined to map every angle and blind spot. As days turned into nights, I spent long hours within the museum's walls. The hum of the air conditioning, the distant footsteps of night guards, and the occasional flicker of the security monitors became the soundtrack of my investigation. I studied the patterns of daily operations, identifying moments when the museum was most vulnerable, shift changes, maintenance breaks, and the quiet lull after closing. One evening, while reviewing footage from a rarely used service entrance, I noticed something unusual. A brief flicker in the camera feed, lasting less than a second, but enough to obscure a shadowy figure moving swiftly past. The timestamp coincided with a known security lapse caused by a scheduled power reset. It was the first tangible clue, a ghost in the machine hinting at the presence of someone exploiting even the smallest gaps. The next day, I coordinated with the security team to increase patrols around that area, hoping to catch any activity. We also enhanced sensor sensitivity, though this carried the risk of more false alarms. Yet, every beep and blip was now scrutinized with greater urgency. The tension in the museum was palpable. Staff moved with quiet vigilance, aware that something beyond the usual had unsettled their sanctuary. The artworks themselves seemed to hold their breath, as if sensing the threat to their existence. Then came the night of the heist. It was a night when the city outside lay cloaked in cool desert darkness. The museum's lights dimmed to a soft glow. I was on site, overseeing the security operations, alert and watchful. The guards had been briefed, and additional personnel stationed in key locations. At first, everything seemed normal. The rhythmic footsteps of the patrols echoed through the galleries. The monitors displayed steady images, and the silence was almost comforting. Then, the alarm sounded. Not a blaring siren, but a subtle electronic pulse, the signal of a breach detected near the contemporary art wing. Cameras caught a glimpse of movement. Fluid, precise, practiced. The intruder was neither hurried nor careless, but focused and efficient. The security team sprang into action. Doors were locked remotely, lights brightened, and the museum's internal communication channels buzzed with urgency. I moved quickly toward the scene, heart pounding but mind sharp. We intercepted the intruder just as they attempted to access a secured vault housing a recently acquired collection of rare ceramics. The figure froze momentarily, then vanished into a hidden passageway, disappearing into the labyrinthine corridors beneath the museum. What followed was a tense game of cat and mouse through the museum's underbelly, service tunnels, maintenance shafts, and forgotten stairwells. The intruder was adept, anticipating our moves, slipping through shadows with a skill that suggested intimate knowledge of the building. Despite our best efforts, the thief managed to evade capture. Yet, what struck me most was what they left behind, a single item carefully placed on the floor in the main hall. It was a small, intricately carved chess piece, a knight made from ivory and onyx. A calling card, perhaps, or a message. The heist was audacious but strangely restrained. Nothing was damaged, no alarms triggered beyond the initial breach, and no artwork was stolen. Instead, the intruder seemed to want us to know they had been there, to challenge the museum's security and provoke a response. In the days that followed, the Louvre Abu Dhabi tightened its defenses further. We reviewed every protocol, enhanced electronic surveillance, and increased staff training. Yet the mystery of the chess piece lingered, a symbol of strategy, foresight, and the endless game of pursuit. Reflecting on the event, I realized the heist was not merely about theft. It was a statement, an intricate dance between creator and challenger, guardian and intruder. The museum was a fortress, but also a stage where stories unfolded, not always in the light, but often in the shadows. The art remained safe, its silent witnesses to a night when history and mystery intertwined beneath the dome of the Louvre Abu Dhabi. And I, standing amidst these treasures, understood that sometimes the greatest heist is not the one of stolen objects, but the theft of certainty itself. After the intruder vanished into the labyrinth beneath the museum, the atmosphere inside the Louvre Abu Dhabi shifted palpably. The initial shock gave way to a collective determination to understand what had happened, and why. The security team and I pored over every detail, from camera footage to access logs, trying to trace the steps of the elusive figure. The chess piece, the knight, remained the most puzzling clue. Crafted with exquisite detail, it felt less like a trophy and more like a deliberate message. In chess, the knight is unique, capable of unexpected moves that defy straightforward paths. Was this a symbol of the intruder's strategy? A subtle taunt, suggesting they had outmaneuvered the museum's defenses? Or perhaps a hint toward something deeper? As days passed, I found myself drawn to the piece, turning it over in my hands during long hours at the office. It felt cold yet strangely alive, a miniature sculpture embodying a quiet elegance and power. I researched its design and origin, discovering that similar pieces came from an ancient set once owned by a royal family in the region, an artifact of history mingling with the present. This connection seemed significant. Could the intruder have a personal or symbolic motive tied to heritage or identity? The Louvre Abu Dhabi, after all, is not only a custodian of art, but a cultural bridge, representing a dialogue between East and West. The heist, or rather the intrusion, felt like part of a larger narrative, one that questioned ownership, legacy, and the meaning of preservation. The investigation deepened with the cooperation of local authorities and museum experts. Interviews with staff revealed a network of dedicated individuals who loved the institution, yet were aware of its vulnerabilities. The intruder had exploited not just physical gaps, but perhaps also a gap in trust or awareness. In the end, no stolen artwork was recovered, and no suspect was publicly identified. Yet, the incident sparked a transformation within the museum. Security protocols were revamped, technology upgraded, and a renewed culture of vigilance embraced. More importantly, it inspired reflection on the delicate balance between accessibility and protection in cultural spaces. I realized that the true heist was not about material loss, but about challenging complacency. The intruder, through their silent performance, reminded us all that even the most revered institutions must remain awake, adaptive, and humble in the face of change. Months later, as I walked once more beneath the dome of the Louvre Abu Dhabi, the sunlight filtering through the lattice, I felt a renewed appreciation for the museum's role, not just as a keeper of treasures, but as a living, breathing space where stories, past and present, continue to unfold. The chess piece remained on my desk, a reminder of the night when art, history, and mystery intersected in the desert light. A symbol of a game still in play, and of the unseen guardians who protect the fragile beauty of human creation. Story 3. The bitter chill of a Paris winter had settled over the city when I arrived at the headquarters of the central office for the fight against cybercrime. The air was sharp, and the narrow streets carried the scent of rain and cold asphalt. Paris, often romanticized as the city of light, had another side, a shadowed domain where invisible battles waged on screens and through lines of code. This was where I found myself now, a part of a team tasked with dismantling one of the most elusive cybercrime rings Europe had seen. As a cybersecurity analyst turned field investigator, I had long worked behind the scenes, deciphering patterns and tracing digital footprints. But this operation demanded more. An immersion into the pulse of a hidden network, a deep dive into the tangled web of hackers, fraudsters, and data thieves whose actions rippled far beyond Paris. The cybercrime ring we targeted was sophisticated, operating with a level of coordination that suggested experience and resources. Their schemes included identity theft, financial fraud, and infiltration of corporate systems. The damage was calculated, subtle, often invisible to victims until the consequences became devastating. Our investigation began months earlier, piecing together data from compromised servers, analyzing transaction anomalies, and monitoring chatter across encrypted channels. The group's footprint stretched across several countries, but their core appeared centered in Paris. Pinpointing exact locations was a challenge. These criminals knew how to cover their tracks using VPNs, proxies, and dark web marketplaces. In the weeks leading to January, we had gathered enough evidence to prepare a coordinated operation. Intelligence suggested a planned data breach targeting a major European bank. The stakes were high and the timing critical. The operation was meticulously planned. Teams aligned across jurisdictions, roles assigned with precision, and protocols established for every eventuality. I spent days in the nerve center monitoring feeds and coordinating with law enforcement units. Each keystroke, each data packet became a potential clue. The tension was palpable, but beneath it lay a sense of purpose. This was not just about catching criminals, but about protecting millions of unsuspecting people whose lives depended on the integrity of digital systems. The night before the bust, Paris was quiet. The city's famous landmarks glowed softly under streetlights, oblivious to the unfolding drama behind closed doors. I found myself reflecting on the evolution of crime in the digital age, how threats no longer came through physical force, but through codes and algorithms. At the scheduled hour, the operation commenced. Multiple locations were raided simultaneously: apartments, offices, and hidden server rooms. The coordination was seamless. Teams moved swiftly, securing devices, collecting evidence, and detaining suspects. I was part of the digital task force, tasked with immediate forensic analysis on site. Our job was to extract data, decrypt files, and preserve evidence for prosecution. The technology was advanced, but so was the cybercriminals' ingenuity. Passwords were scrambled, encryption layered, but we were prepared. As hours passed, the magnitude of the operation became clear. We uncovered stolen identities, malware code, transaction records, and communication logs that painted a detailed picture of the ring's activities. The evidence was overwhelming, a testament to the scale and sophistication of the network. Throughout the night, I worked alongside experts in cyber forensics, digital law, and international coordination. Despite the exhaustion, a sense of accomplishment grew. We were not just breaking a ring. We were restoring trust in the systems people relied on daily. In the aftermath, the city began to wake, unaware of how close it had come to a large-scale financial disaster. Media coverage would later highlight the bust as a major victory, but for those of us involved, it was a reminder of the ongoing battle to secure the digital frontier. The suspects faced legal proceedings, and the investigation continued to unravel connections beyond Paris. Our team remained vigilant, knowing this was one victory in a long and complex war against cybercrime. As I left the headquarters, the morning sun pierced through the clouds, casting a hopeful light on the Seine. Paris resumed its rhythm, blending history and modernity, resilience and change. I walked those streets, aware that beneath the city's beauty, the invisible wars continued, fought by guardians like us, in silence and shadows. The days following the raid were a whirlwind of analysis, debriefings, and cross-border communications. Every seized device required careful examination, not just to find evidence that could be used in court, but to understand how this ring operated at such a level of complexity. Working alongside French cyber specialists and international partners, I delved into layers of encrypted files, hidden partitions, and cleverly disguised code. The criminals had employed advanced evasion tactics: self-deleting scripts, fake IP addresses routed through multiple countries, and encrypted chat platforms designed to vanish without a trace. Yet, the traces they left behind told a story of coordinated efforts, shared responsibilities, and a fractured digital ecosystem where trust was easily exploited. The ring was not a monolith but a network of individuals, each playing a role from coding malware to laundering money through cryptocurrency exchanges. One detail that stood out was the use of social engineering, an age-old technique adapted to modern technology. The criminals had created fake profiles, posing as legitimate company employees or clients, to gather sensitive information. Their phishing campaigns were meticulously crafted, personalized, and convincing. I spent long nights sifting through email headers, transaction records, and chat logs. Patterns emerged, revealing how the ring had infiltrated multiple organizations over the course of several years. The scale was staggering, but so was the resilience of the investigators and law enforcement officials dedicated to dismantling it. Throughout the investigation, I was reminded of the fragility of our digital world. Behind every login and transaction lies a system vulnerable to manipulation, yet also defended by the vigilance and ingenuity of countless professionals. This duality, the risk and the protection, defined the landscape in which I operated. In quiet moments, I reflected on the human element behind the screens. The victims, whose identities were stolen, the banks and corporations, whose reputations were at stake, and the criminals themselves, whose motivations ranged from greed to ideology. Understanding these motivations was key to prevention and response. The trial that followed was comprehensive. Prosecutors presented the evidence gathered meticulously over months, and the defendants faced charges ranging from fraud to unauthorized access. The court proceedings were a reminder of the importance of law and order in cyberspace, a domain often perceived as boundless and anonymous, yet subject to real-world consequences. With the ring dismantled, a wave of reassurance swept through the industry. Security measures were updated, employee training intensified, and international cooperation deepened. The bust became a case study in effective collaboration and the evolving nature of cybercrime. As for me, the experience reinforced my commitment to this field. Cybersecurity was not just a profession. It was a responsibility to safeguard the infrastructure that underpins modern life. The work was unending, the threats constantly evolving, but so was our resolve. Paris, with its rich history of revolution and innovation, had become a frontline in the digital age's most subtle wars. Walking its streets, I carried the knowledge that the city's future depended as much on encryption and firewalls as on art and architecture. The cybercrime ring bust was a milestone, a testament to what could be achieved when expertise, dedication, and cooperation converged. Yet, it was also a reminder that vigilance must never wane, for in the shadows of technology, new challenges are always emerging. In the end, the story was not just about catching criminals, but about preserving trust, the invisible thread that connects us all in a world increasingly woven by digital threads. Story 4. The cold, damp air of the London Underground always carried a certain weight, a mixture of human urgency, quiet desperation, and the muted rhythm of trains sliding through dark tunnels. I had been commuting daily through these veins beneath the city for years, never imagining how this routine journey would spiral into something far more unsettling. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly, a glance that lingered a moment too long, a shadow in the carriage, seemingly always nearby yet never quite within reach. At first, I dismissed it as mere coincidence, the product of overactive imagination or fatigue from long workdays. But as days passed, the feeling of being watched grew undeniable. Every morning, as I boarded the 8:15 train from King's Cross to Waterloo, the same figure appeared, a man whose presence was both nondescript and unervingly consistent. He never approached, never spoke, but his eyes seemed fixed on me, unwavering in their attention. The anonymity of the crowd, the dull roar of conversations, and the constant hum of the subway should have provided comfort, yet instead, they amplified my unease. I began to alter my routines, switching carriages, changing entry points, even varying my time slightly. But the shadow adapted seamlessly, always reappearing, as if attuned to my movements. The London Underground, a place once defined by its chaotic anonymity, had transformed into a confined labyrinth where I was relentlessly pursued. The psychological weight was heavier than any physical threat. It was the erosion of safety, the subtle invasion of personal space that left me vigilant, anxious. I found myself studying surveillance footage in my free moments, noting every familiar face, every pattern. The man's image became etched in my memory. Average build, mid-30s, dark coat, always wearing a cap pulled low. Despite the growing fear, I refused to let this shadow dictate my life. London was my home, the underground a passage I had no choice but to traverse. I sought solace in facts, evidence, and eventually the decision to involve the authorities. The Metropolitan Police Cyber and Public Safety Unit listened attentively. They acknowledged the delicate nature of stalking cases in public spaces, where evidence is often fleeting and the perpetrator blends seamlessly into crowds. Yet, they reassured me that steps would be taken to increase surveillance in key locations and increase patrolling during peak hours. We reviewed camera footage together, combing through hours of grainy images. The stalker's pattern was clear. He followed not just me but several others, always maintaining a distance, careful to avoid direct confrontation or suspicion. His presence was a silent threat, a whisper of danger amid the noise. Over the weeks, the authorities intensified their presence underground. Plainclothes officers mingled with commuters, and additional cameras were installed at stations where the stalker was most frequently sighted. The community, once indifferent to the nuances of such threats, became more aware. Strangers exchanged glances, subtly watching their surroundings, sharing unspoken support. As the investigation progressed, I worked closely with officers, providing detailed observations and noting behavioral patterns. It became a study in human psychology, how fear alters perception, how predators manipulate anonymity, and how vigilance becomes a form of resilience. One chilly evening in late January, the breakthrough came. A routine patrol spotted the stalker in the act of following another commuter too closely. Officers intervened swiftly, and the man was detained for questioning. The relief was profound, though tempered by the understanding that this was but one chapter in a larger issue of public safety. In the aftermath, I reflected on the complexity of fear and safety in urban life. The London Underground, a microcosm of the city itself, embodies both connection and isolation. It is a space where millions cross paths daily, yet so many remain invisible to each other's struggles. The experience left me changed, more cautious, certainly, but also more connected to the community around me. I realized that safety is not just a personal concern, but a collective responsibility. The vigilance of strangers, the responsiveness of authorities, and the courage to speak up all contribute to reclaiming public spaces from fear. As February dawned over London, the city continued its relentless pace. The underground train still roared through tunnels, carrying hopes, dreams, and stories untold. And beneath the surface, a renewed commitment to safety and solidarity quietly took root. In the days that followed the arrest, the atmosphere within the underground shifted subtly but perceptibly. The spaces that once felt claustrophobic and fraught with uncertainty began to regain their usual rhythm. Commuters moved with a bit more ease, and though vigilance remained, it was no longer overshadowed by an invisible threat stalking the tunnels. The police shared with me that the man detained had a history of minor offenses, mostly involving harassment, but nothing had escalated to this level before. Their investigation uncovered that his behavior was driven by loneliness and a distorted need for control, not by violent intent. It was a reminder that many fears in public spaces stem from complex human conditions, where harm can be psychological as much as physical. During the case's resolution, I found myself reflecting deeply on the role technology played in both enabling and countering such threats. The surveillance systems, while once just a background feature, had become indispensable tools. They preserved moments, caught details invisible to the human eye in real time, and formed the backbone of the evidence that led to the stalker's capture. Yet, there remained a delicate balance to maintain. The presence of cameras and security personnel must not transform public spaces into fortresses where freedom is stifled. It was about creating environments where safety and openness coexist, where people feel secure without sacrificing their privacy or sense of community. Beyond the immediate case, I realized that the story extended to many others: commuters, travelers, and city dwellers who silently navigate fears born of uncertainty. The London Underground is not just a transit system. It is a shared space that connects lives, a place where each person's story is interwoven with countless others. My experience instilled a new sense of responsibility. I became involved in local initiatives promoting awareness and support for victims of stalking and harassment. These programs aimed not only to educate but to foster solidarity, helping people reclaim their confidence in public spaces. The collaboration between citizens and law enforcement grew stronger. Workshops, public discussions, and digital campaigns emphasized the importance of vigilance without paranoia. People learned how to recognize signs of stalking and harassment, how to report concerns safely, and how to support those affected. Meanwhile, the underground itself saw improvements. Emergency communication points were enhanced, lighting was upgraded in less trafficked areas, and signage was made clearer to encourage safer movement. The integration of technology continued, with smart sensors and AI-driven monitoring systems complementing human oversight. Through all of this, my perspective evolved. Fear had once held a quiet dominion over my daily life, but through action, community, and understanding, it transformed into cautious hope. The story of the London Underground stalker was no longer just about a threat. It was about resilience, recovery, and the power of collective care. I resumed my commutes, still alert but less burdened by anxiety. Each journey became a reaffirmation of the city's enduring spirit. London, beneath its surface, was alive with stories of struggle and triumph, of shadows and light intertwined. The experience changed me, but it also connected me more deeply to the pulse of urban life. I understood that safety is a living, breathing effort, a mosaic of technology, human kindness, and shared vigilance. And as the trains rumbled on, threading through the city's veins, I felt a renewed faith that even in the darkest tunnels, there is always a path forward. Story 5. I arrived in Istanbul on a rainy Thursday morning in January 2025, expecting a routine assignment that would last no more than 10 days. As an independent political researcher, I had been working on a series of reports about power transitions and corruption in major Eurasian cities. Istanbul, rich with historical intrigue and always pulsing beneath the surface with political tension, was the final stop in my circuit. The city greeted me with its usual symphony of car horns, seagull cries, and the distant echo of ferry horns on the Bosphorus. I checked into a modest hotel in Beyoğlu, near Taksim Square. It had tall windows that overlooked the narrow alleys and stone buildings, their rooftops wet and glistening. The neighborhood was vibrant, but that week it felt oddly subdued, as though the city itself had lowered its voice. My assignment was to investigate whispers of clandestine political dealings involving a recently elected figure whose name had begun surfacing in classified European intelligence documents. These documents, leaked through a secure digital channel, had made their way to a handful of investigative agencies across Europe, including the group I occasionally collaborated with. According to the information I'd reviewed, one of the local advisors to this political figure had gone missing in December under suspicious circumstances. No official statement had been released. The story had been buried almost immediately. I intended to dig deeper. Over the first few days, I met discreetly with sources in quiet cafes and out-of-the-way archives, gathering pieces of a puzzle that seemed to resist being solved. Something about this case made people uneasy. Everyone I spoke to offered fragments, never a full picture. A man had vanished, perhaps kidnapped, perhaps exiled. His name, Arda Keskin, had once been tied to reformist agendas but more recently had distanced himself from his political allies. His silence had been abrupt, unexplained. As I studied Arda's past appearances in media, official documents, and obscure blogs, I noticed a pattern. In the months leading up to his disappearance, his public schedule had changed dramatically. Meetings were canceled without explanation, and his social media presence had gone from active to absent in a matter of days. Then I found something stranger. A blurred CCTV image dated January 3, 2025, showing a man matching Arda's appearance being led out of an underground car park in Besiktas by two individuals in plain clothes. It was the first real evidence I had that something sinister had occurred. On the 5th day of my stay, I received an anonymous file on my encrypted drive. Metadata suggested it had been recorded from a surveillance drone. The file contained several minutes of shaky black and white footage that appeared to show a small compound on the outskirts of the city. Near a grove of winter-bare trees, a van arrived under the cover of night and two hooded figures emerged. They opened the rear doors and dragged something or someone into the building. I studied the coordinates embedded in the file. The location was a quiet industrial zone, mostly inactive during winter months. There were no major businesses registered there, only warehouses and logistical centers with limited foot traffic. It was reckless, but I had come this far. I rented a car and drove out the next morning, weaving through fog-shrouded roads until the city skyline disappeared behind me. The compound was exactly where the footage had shown. A weathered metal gate guarded the front, flanked by two small security cameras angled downward. I didn't approach directly. Instead, I parked several streets away and walked to a nearby ridge where I could observe the building through binoculars. What I saw unsettled me. The place was far from abandoned. Car idled by the back door. Lights flickered inside occasionally, and every few hours, a figure stepped out, smoked a cigarette, and disappeared again. The rhythms suggested routine, organization. I returned to my hotel that night with my mind racing. I had more questions than answers. Who was inside the compound? Was Arda still alive? And why had this been hidden so well? I decided to inform one of my contacts at a European watchdog organization, sending them copies of the footage and my notes so far. I didn't yet realize how close I had wandered to something much larger. The next morning, I found a printed envelope slid under my door. Inside was a single sheet of paper. It bore no signature or logo, only a typed sentence in English. Do not follow what is meant to disappear. The message was a clear warning. Still, I stayed. I changed hotels the same day and began working from libraries and internet cafes across the city, blending in, moving often. I felt eyes on me occasionally, especially in quieter neighborhoods. It was not paranoia. Something had shifted. Whatever network I had stumbled into was real, and it had reach. On the 8th day, my contact from the watchdog agency responded. He confirmed that Arda Keskin was being kept in what they called soft containment, a political maneuver not officially sanctioned but tolerated by higher authorities. The compound I had discovered wasn't just any facility. It was connected to a ghost company, a shell organization registered in northern Cyprus, with ties to both private security firms and retired government officials. The scandal, they said, would be explosive if proven. It would implicate not only political actors in Turkey, but potentially even European intermediaries who had facilitated Arda's silence in exchange for diplomatic favors. But there was a problem. The more people who knew, the more dangerous it became. I spent my final 3 days in Istanbul compiling all the evidence I had gathered. I met one last time with a journalist friend who promised to store my findings and release them through secure channels if anything happened to me. I didn't trust cloud storage anymore, nor even encrypted servers. Too many of the leaks I'd reviewed had originated from compromised platforms. On my final night in the city, I stood by the Galata Bridge as fishing lines dipped silently into the dark waters of the Golden Horn. The cold breeze whispered through my coat, and for the first time since arriving, I allowed myself a moment of stillness. I had come in search of answers, but what I found was a layered system of silence, a mechanism so well-oiled it almost erased its own tracks. Arda Keskin's disappearance was not just a crime. It was a message, a symbol of what happens when someone becomes inconvenient to too many people. There was no dramatic confrontation, no clear villain, just systems, relationships, and the subtle machinery of control. When I boarded my flight the next morning, Istanbul faded beneath the clouds, its secrets still pulsing in the alleys, its stories hidden in the cracks of stone facades. I left behind no trace but a few encrypted files, a journal of handwritten notes, and the hope that someone, somewhere, would listen. The scandal had only begun. Story 6. The cold had arrived late that winter in Amsterdam. The kind of cold that didn't announce itself with frost or snow, but rather seeped slowly into bones and brickwork. I had come to the Netherlands for what I thought would be a quiet winter, a seasonal break from the burnout I'd been nursing after several years of investigative work across Eastern Europe and North Africa. My intent was simple. Rent a small apartment along the Prinsengracht, walk among the canals, and perhaps write something less heavy than what I was used to. Instead, I found myself in the middle of something unexpected, strange, and quietly dangerous. I had rented a modest studio on the 4th floor of an aging building in the Debarsches district. The neighborhood was neither fully modern nor forgotten, just comfortable, with its bakeries, corner cafes, and the low murmur of residential life. I liked it for its rhythm. Nothing stood out. People kept to themselves, and that suited me. My apartment overlooked a narrow alley bordered by a vacant warehouse. The building was unremarkable. Gray, low-roofed, and mostly quiet, except for the occasional delivery truck that pulled up late at night. I assumed it was storage for construction supplies or a distribution point for local vendors. That was before the soundproofing began. It started subtly. Large panels brought in during the early hours, installed swiftly with no signage or explanation. The windows were soon blacked out. A new security camera appeared, mounted high and angled directly at the alley. I watched it all unfold over the course of a week, notebook in hand, habit pulling me back into observation mode even as I told myself to look away. One evening in early January, just after sunset, I noticed the alley glowing faintly, not from outside lighting, but from within the warehouse. A low, pulsing hue, soft blue, sometimes shifting toward violet, the kind of glow you associate with grow lights or laboratory equipment. But it wasn't the color that unsettled me. It was the vibration that followed. Low, nearly imperceptible, but strong enough to rattle the glass in my kitchen cabinet. I knew the signs. I had seen similar setups during my time in southern Spain, where quiet industrial parks had masked synthetic drug operations for years. The pieces came together quickly. Remote location, limited foot traffic, late-night deliveries, soundproofing, and now a humming light source. I suspected it was a drug lab, high-tech, possibly synthetic-based, and operating beneath the radar. Could have ignored it, but I didn't. I began recording a timeline, discreetly without stepping too close. Through the blinds, I logged vehicle plates, delivery patterns, and the timing of electrical fluctuations. At one point, I noticed new ventilation tubing installed on the roof. Whatever was happening inside that warehouse was increasing in intensity. On the 11th of January, the glow stopped. The alley went dark again. No trucks arrived. No staff moved in or out. I assumed they had packed up and gone mobile. These operations didn't stay in one place too long. I made peace with the thought that perhaps it had ended, until the explosion happened. It was early morning, still dark outside, when the first tremor rolled through the apartment. At first, I thought it was thunder, but the flash that followed lit up the whole alley with an eerie white glow. Then came the blast, a muffled, concussive force that shook the walls and shattered the lower window of my stairwell. I ran to the balcony. Below, black smoke billowed from the roof of the warehouse, curling upward like ink in water. There was no fireball, no outward destruction. The building still stood, but something had gone catastrophically wrong inside. Within minutes, sirens filled the air. Fire services arrived swiftly, followed by hazmat units. They didn't approach the building immediately. They waited, tested, confirmed something before moving forward. It was then that I knew my suspicions had been right all along. From the street, I watched men in sealed suits enter the warehouse. One carried what looked like a Geiger counter. Another held a clipboard with color-coded tabs. A drone was launched to circle the site from above. No media had arrived yet. The perimeter was quickly sealed off with temporary fencing and vehicles marked with emblems I didn't recognize. Whatever had exploded, it wasn't ordinary chemicals, and it wasn't meant to be found. I returned to my apartment and began compiling my notes. There was something about the speed of the response that nagged at me. It was too efficient, too rehearsed, as though the authorities had expected something like this might happen, or worse, had chosen not to intervene earlier. That night, the entire block lost power. From my window, I saw unmarked vans arrive. Equipment was moved into the alley under floodlights powered by generators. The smoke had mostly dissipated, but the building was still off-limits. From the way they treated the site, I suspected contamination of some sort, likely chemical, possibly biological. I received no answers from city services. The following morning, the only official statement was a brief mention of an industrial accident involving outdated refrigeration systems. No injuries, no arrests, no cause for alarm, but the warehouse was quietly demolished 2 days later. I managed to find someone at a nearby cafe who'd seen the blast too, an older man who lived in the adjacent building. He told me the smell that morning reminded him of burnt plastic and something metallic, something unnatural. He said the birds didn't return to the trees in the alley. They hadn't since. By the end of the week, the alley was paved over. The security camera was gone. A new company had purchased the land, and plans were filed for a co-working space and art gallery. A clever smokescreen, I thought. Urban renewal as camouflage. But the story didn't end there. A month after the explosion, I was contacted by a digital forensics researcher who'd read a brief post I'd anonymously published on a secure forum. He said he had access to satellite logs from the night of the explosion thermal imaging. He shared them with me. The data revealed a rapid spike in temperature not just in the warehouse, but in a secondary location 3 blocks away, an apartment building with no known affiliation to the site. It appeared the lab wasn't the only node. There had been others. I quietly left Amsterdam that week. My lease ended early. I didn't file a formal report. There are some stories that aren't meant to be chased, especially when the trail runs beneath layers of controlled silence. But I kept my notes. Sometimes, late at night, I revisit them, not to solve the case, but to remind myself of how close I had come to something designed to stay hidden. The explosion was a warning, not just to the operators inside, but to anyone watching. A final burst of fire and vapor meant to erase traces of something synthetic, dangerous, and carefully protected. I returned home to a quieter life, but the alley still haunts me. I can still see the pale violet light behind the blacked-out windows, still feel the low hum beneath my feet, still wonder what might have been brewing behind those steel doors, and how close the city came to something far worse. The official story will always say it was an accident, but some of us know better. Story 7. When I landed in Dubai that January morning, I hadn't expected to stay long. My assignment was simple: 2 weeks to conduct an internal audit for a mid-sized financial firm based in the Dubai International Financial Center. I had taken similar contracts before. This one, however, would be different. Quiet at first, then increasingly complex, until it turned into something that consumed every moment of my stay. The city shimmered with precision. Clean boulevards, towering glass towers, and a ceaseless rhythm of commerce. It felt almost clinical, as if everything had been designed for movement and display. I checked into a modest apartment in Business Bay, overlooking the winding creek and the silhouettes of construction cranes that never seemed to rest. My office was just a 10-minute walk away. The firm was called Al Thuraya Investments, and on the surface, everything seemed in order. Their portfolio was impressive: logistics, real estate, tech ventures, spanning multiple continents. My role was to verify internal compliance structures, mostly routine, and to ensure that international reporting standards had been followed. But by the third day, I noticed inconsistencies. It began with transaction timestamps, logs that didn't quite match server records. I flagged a few for review and made a note to check the backups. That evening, while compiling my summary, I discovered something stranger: mirrored entries from 2 different departments, routed through a shadow entity I hadn't been briefed on. It was labeled Cadre Solutions, a name that didn't appear on any official vendor list. I paused, not yet suspicious. It could have been a temporary shell, used for restructuring or tax optimization. I'd seen similar setups in London and Geneva. Still, I marked it down. A part of me sensed that this detail might grow in significance. The next morning, I asked for access to the firm's archival systems. With a VPN secured and the appropriate clearances granted, I explored months of historic transactions. Most looked normal, but then I noticed a pattern. Small sums, repeated daily, funneled through various holding companies before returning to the primary account. It was a classic laundering loop, masked by the frequency and subtlety of the amounts. From there, it became difficult to look away. I traced the flow to an offshore node in Mauritius, which then bounced through a facade of payment processors in Southeast Asia. Each path led to another, deliberately obfuscated, designed to be dismissed as background noise in the ocean of financial activity. The deeper I looked, the more familiar the architecture felt. Years ago, I'd come across a similar method in a case involving fake export invoices in Eastern Europe. That case had ended with sealed courtrooms and a dozen resignations. This one, however, seemed larger, quieter, but deeper. I found myself working longer hours. I barely noticed the world outside my glass-walled office. I lived on coffee and data. Each breadcrumb led to another, revealing a silent architecture that had embedded itself into the company's core. At one point, I came across internal memos dated months earlier, authorizing transfers that should have required board approval, but bore only a single signature. That signature belonged to someone I hadn't met, MN Ramani. His name appeared frequently, though always in indirect ways, approval forms, expense reports, executive summaries. But oddly, he wasn't listed on the current leadership structure. I searched for internal correspondence and found nothing. His email credentials had been deactivated. When I asked about him casually over lunch with a junior analyst, I received only a vague shrug. He left suddenly, they said, early last year. Something about restructuring. But restructuring didn't explain the fact that Ramani's credentials had still been active weeks after his departure, or that transactions had continued to bear his authorization. It was clear something was wrong. I documented everything carefully, maintaining a dual record, one for the firm's compliance team, and a second, more detailed version for myself. My instincts told me to tread lightly. I'd learned from experience that even a whisper of financial irregularity in such environments could trigger panic, or worse, lead to sudden obstructions from within. On my 10th day, I arrived to find my network access temporarily disabled. A systems update, they claimed. When it was restored an hour later, I found several of my bookmarked files missing or restricted. Fortunately, I'd already made local backups. I no longer believed I was simply dealing with internal negligence. This was deliberate, and it had been going on for much longer than anyone admitted. The total figure was staggering, hundreds of transactions over 18 months, routed through dozens of paper companies, ultimately returning to a handful of personal accounts linked to the same surnames, repeated quietly in layers of documentation. I submitted a partial report to the firm's board, focusing only on procedural weaknesses. I omitted the deeper fraud for the time being, uncertain how widely the knowledge extended. That night, I took a long walk through the marina, trying to make sense of it all. Dubai was vast, beautiful, and impenetrable. The skyline blinked with coded ambition. I felt like a shadow navigating its understructure, brushing against systems designed to remain unseen. For the first time in years, I felt the old pressure again, the quiet weight of discovery, the loneliness that comes with it. The final piece arrived on my last day, an encrypted email sent through a dead account. The address was familiar. It belonged to Ramani, contained no text, just a spreadsheet. It listed every transaction, grouped by category, with notes appended in shorthand. At the bottom, one sentence, "This is as far as I could go." It was a confession of sorts, or maybe an invitation. I didn't respond. Instead, I flew home with my notes, my backups, and a digital trail that pointed not only to internal theft, but to external involvement, contractors, shell consultants, even a few connections to investment vehicles based in the Caymans. It was sprawling, silent, profitable. Back in Europe, I submitted an anonymous tip to the UAE's central bank, attaching a summary of my findings. I kept the full archive for myself, unsure where it might lead or whether I'd return to it. Weeks passed. Then a headline appeared, "Banking executive detained in ongoing fraud probe." It was buried in the financial section of a lesser-known outlet. No names, no details, just a brief confirmation that internal irregularities had been flagged and that an investigation was underway. No one mentioned Ramani, but I recognized the building in the background of the photograph, Al Thureya's headquarters. The investigation had begun. I never returned to Dubai. My work took me elsewhere, but the quiet pressure of that case stayed with me. Not because it had been dramatic or dangerous, but because it had been so subtle, so deliberate. Proof, once again, that deception doesn't need noise to grow. Sometimes all it needs is silence and just enough trust. Story 8. When I boarded the Hibiya line that cold January morning, I had no way of knowing what was about to unfold beneath Tokyo's polished streets. The train was already half full, filled with the usual assortment of passengers, office workers, students, elderly couples holding cloth shopping bags. I took a standing spot near the rear of the carriage, gripping the polished rail as the train shuddered into motion. It was just another morning in a city that never seemed to stop moving. I had arrived in Tokyo 2 weeks earlier to assist with a cybersecurity workshop at a university in Minato. The rhythm of Tokyo had always comforted me. Precise, clean, restrained. My workdays were filled with presentations and late-night laptop sessions. The evenings with walks through neon corridors and the rustle of wind between narrow alleyways. That morning, the air inside the train felt heavier than usual. It wasn't anything obvious, just a faint sense, like something was slightly off. I blamed it on the dryness of winter, or maybe a cold beginning to settle in. As we approached Kaibacho Station, I noticed the man sitting directly across from me. He wore a gray suit and carried a slim briefcase on his lap. His face was blank, his hands still, too still. But what struck me wasn't his expression. It was the thin glimmer of condensation on the inside of the briefcase's metal clasp. Something cold or chemical, perhaps. I blinked, unsure why that detail had lodged itself in my brain. When the train started again, the lights flickered briefly. Just a second, maybe two. It was common in older lines. No one reacted. I held my breath out of instinct, then released it slowly. The train continued on, smooth and silent. We reached Hachibori, then Tsukiji. By then, the air had shifted noticeably. It wasn't a scent, more like the absence of one. A clean sterility that reminded me of laboratories. A man to my left coughed. A dry sound. Another followed, and then another. I watched with growing unease as passengers began shifting in place. A woman rubbed her temples. Someone dropped a phone. A schoolboy leaned against a pole, eyes closed, breathing fast. Still no panic, just confusion. Fatigue, maybe. Tokyo passengers rarely made scenes. But something was undeniably wrong. I could feel it in my lungs, a constriction, a faint pressure. At the next stop, several people exited hurriedly. One stumbled. The doors closed too soon, leaving one woman behind to tap on the glass uselessly as the train pulled away. That was when I began to feel dizzy. I steadied myself against the pole and forced my thoughts into order. This wasn't just winter air or poor ventilation. Something had been introduced into the environment. Not through the air vents, not directly. It was more subtle, possibly a vapor nearly invisible. I reached for my phone and opened my notes app, typing out what I was observing. Symptoms, car number, direction of travel, locations. It wasn't panic I felt, but urgency, an investigator's instinct. I'd been part of incident response teams before. Patterns mattered. Timelines mattered. We reached Ginza and nearly half the passengers exited. A few staggered. Two remained seated, hunched. I stepped off the train just as the chime rang and the doors began to close behind me. The platform felt brighter than usual. Artificial, clean, but oddly muted, as though the entire station had fallen into a kind of trance. I moved to the far end and watched the train continue its journey toward Roppongi. Something about that train bothered me. It wasn't just the passengers. It was the silence, the stillness inside. I made my way upstairs to the ticket gates, but the barriers remained open, unblinking. No guards, no announcements. On the street, the city looked normal. Cars moved in smooth flows, traffic lights blinked in patient rhythms. I walked quickly to a nearby convenience store, hoping for a moment to collect myself. I bought a bottle of water and moved to the small bench outside. As I sipped slowly, I checked news apps, social media, anything. There was nothing yet, not a single alert. I refreshed again. Still nothing, but I knew what I'd seen. I trusted my senses and the odd clarity that came in moments like this. I had always prided myself on noticing details, the kinds that slipped past others. The train wasn't malfunctioning. The passengers weren't just tired. Something had happened underground, something quiet and deliberate. I returned to my apartment later that morning and compiled my notes into a private report. I mapped each station where symptoms began, listed timestamps, symptoms, and behavior changes. I used air quality data from public sensors in the subway network. There were small anomalies, just enough to suggest a spike in compounds that didn't belong. Still no news, still no updates. But at noon, a quiet post appeared on a government bulletin board. Just a notice about a temporary line disruption due to mechanical inspection. No mention of passengers. No details. That evening, I returned to the station out of quiet compulsion. I walked the length of the Hibiya platform, scanning faces, watching the rhythm. Everything looked the same, but a security presence lingered undercover, perhaps. Men in suits pretending to check maps. Plain clothes with earpieces. Something had been discovered, but it wasn't being shared. By the third day, the story broke quietly, almost apologetically, through an independent journalist on a regional news site. It referenced a chemical disturbance in a single carriage on the Hibiya line. There had been no fatalities, they said. A few minor illnesses. Authorities were investigating, but I knew it was more than that. I watched as coverage was pulled within hours. The article disappeared. Cached versions were buried. And then silence returned. In the days that followed, I noticed small details. Subway cars with swapped numbers. Station cleaning crews that stayed twice as long. Security personnel with foreign accents, observing from a distance. I kept my report to myself. I knew what I'd seen. I knew it wasn't an accident. Someone had tested something discreet, perhaps a dispersal mechanism. A trial, not an attack. A proof of concept. There were no fingerprints, no claims, no messages, just silence. Weeks passed. I returned to my regular work. The university thanked me. I packed my bags, boarded a flight back to Europe, and tried to leave it behind. But I still think about that train, about the silence inside, the briefcase with condensation, the way the lights flickered just once, and the look on the face of the man who hadn't moved. There are events that never make headlines, moments buried beneath policies and quiet agreements, incidents too small, too dangerous, or too uncertain to be shared. This was one of them, and I had been there. Story 9. I had arrived in Buenos Aires just after New Year's, eager to settle into a quiet research sabbatical that would give me a break from the intense rhythm of northern winters. The city, shimmering with late summer warmth, welcomed me with its sprawling avenues, layered architecture, and slow, golden sunsets. My apartment was on the 6th floor of a modest building in Palermo, overlooking a wide street dotted with jacaranda trees, their purple flowers already falling in soft heaps on the sidewalks. I was supposed to focus on writing. I'd spent years collecting information on urban data systems and fire response infrastructures across major cities, and Buenos Aires was my final case study. Ironically, my focus on emergency systems soon became more personal than I ever intended. The first fire happened on the 4th day of my stay. I wasn't near it. Only heard about it from a late-night notification from a local alert app one had installed. A small warehouse in San Cristobal had gone up in flames. No casualties. The cause? Unclear. Possibly faulty wiring. Nothing unusual on the surface. But then it happened again 3 days later. This time in Constitution. Another old structure. Empty. No injuries. No looting. Just flames, smoke, and another inconclusive investigation. My curiosity piqued. I started noting the times, locations, and patterns of each fire. I created a folder on my laptop and logged every report I could find, translating them slowly with help from digital tools. I plotted them on a digital map. The fires were all scattered across the city's older neighborhoods, often in neglected corners near transport arteries or old industrial lots. No clear political targets, no stolen goods, and strangely, no messages left behind. By the end of the second week, a third fire erupted, this time in Balvanera. Again, the building was unoccupied. Again, the blaze was contained quickly but efficiently. My map gained another red marker, another flicker of heat in the late summer haze. I found myself walking near one of the older burn sites one afternoon, a few blocks off Avenida Jujuy. The building was already cordoned off, the exterior blackened, the windows gone. There was a kind of eerie neatness to the scene. No vandalism, no news crews, just ash and silence. I began to notice the precision. Each fire had occurred at night, between 1 o'clock and 3 a.m. Each fire had ignited in buildings disconnected from any recent activity. No new tenants, no remodeling, no electrical renovations. It felt like someone had chosen forgotten places, not for damage but for control. It wasn't long before the phrase began to surface. Incendiario serial arsonist. Whispers among neighbors, comments online, but no public declaration. The city, caught between summer tourism and political transitions, didn't want alarm. I kept digging, As I reviewed archived CCTV clips released from one of the scenes, I noticed a figure, hard to see, nearly swallowed by shadows. Just after midnight, they moved along the building's side, disappeared, then the footage fuzzed slightly. Minutes later, the fire began. The figure never returned. The authorities hadn't mentioned the footage, and perhaps they hadn't noticed it. But I did. I replayed it endlessly, freezing frames, enhancing contrast. The person was average height, wore neutral clothing, and carried nothing visibly flammable. Yet they had lit a building aflame with methodical ease. My thoughts turned darker as more dots formed on my map. 8 fires by the 3rd week of January. All the same script. No casualties. No public threats. No patterns in ownership. I started losing sleep. Then, one night, a fire broke out just 6 blocks from my apartment, on a quiet side street in Villa Crespo. I watched the sky change from my window, a slow, rising orange glow, and the faint sound of sirens rolling over the rooftops. I walked closer, drawn not by fear, but by the familiar tug of an unsolved puzzle. The building had been vacant for months. An old textile shop, shut down since before the pandemic. The pattern held. No one inside. No major damage to surrounding properties. And still no answers. I kept writing. My research shifted from fire response theory to documenting the incidents. I contacted local officials, posed as a journalist gathering material for a policy paper. The responses were vague, restrained, no comment, still under investigation, but I sensed the pressure building beneath their words. On a late morning toward the end of January, I sat in a cafe near Recoleta, poring over printouts and annotated maps. I noticed something strange in the data. The fires formed an odd arc through the city, as though tracing a crescent from south to north, slowly moving toward denser residential areas. The pattern wasn't random. It had direction. My next thought chilled me. What if this arc had an endpoint? I cross-referenced real estate databases and zoning maps, looking for vacant or abandoned structures within the projected curve. There weren't many, but one stood out. An old brick customs depot near the Rio de la Plata, just west of Puerto Madero. The building had been unused for years, set back from the street behind a wall of corrugated fencing. It felt like the next logical target. That night, I went to observe. I positioned myself on a rooftop terrace across from the old depot, hidden behind a set of vines and satellite dishes. The night air was still warm, with the occasional gust rolling in from the river. Time passed slowly. Midnight, then 1 o'clock, and then movement. A figure approached from the eastern end, nearly invisible, hugging the fence line. They paused near the rear gate, examined the locks, then moved out of sight. I waited. Minutes later, a dim flicker of light bloomed from within the structure. Not bright, not explosive, just the first soft glimmer of ignition. My heart pounded. I called the local emergency number anonymously, reporting smoke from the warehouse. Then I watched as the figure reappeared, moving calmly in the opposite direction. No rush, no signs of urgency. They melted into the darkness. Fire trucks arrived within minutes. The blaze was small, barely contained to a corner. But it was enough. This time, the authorities caught the pattern too. The arc, the method, the quiet consistency. The following day, the fire department announced a joint investigation with the National Police. They refrained from naming suspects, but their statement hinted at new leads. And just like that, the fires stopped. No arrests, no confessions, no names, just a sudden, complete silence. February passed. March came. I stayed in Buenos Aires longer than planned, writing furiously. My report now included a detailed chronology of each incident, a speculative analysis of the motives, and the eerie suggestion that the fires were a form of message, or perhaps a ritualistic mapping of territory, a slow claim over forgotten spaces. I never saw the figure again, but every time I passed the depot, now under surveillance, I felt that same sense of quiet awe, that someone had walked these streets at night, leaving behind nothing but light and smoke and unanswered questions.